Full house. I'm glad to see that. It's showtime. Okay. Well, this afternoon is part two of Treasure and Tragedy, the Legacy of the Caribbean. And if you caught the first lecture yesterday, we talked about the Spanish fleet of treasure galleons that went back and forth for 300 years, plundering the New World, hauling gold and silver and emeralds back to Spain, and a steady stream of fleets that went back and forth. And it entirely financed the Spanish government and the wars they were in against England, for one. And because this went on so long, and 25% of all the ships were sunk for one reason or another, so there's quite a lot of treasure at the bottom of the sea, and some of it's concentrated in areas like off of Cartagena, Colombia, which was one of the ports these ships docked in. There are over 1,000 treasure galleons sunk that have not been found. So, have at it. And we talked about the two very famous wrecks, the Central America, which was the richest ship that ever sank, and it sank in 7,200 feet of water, 160 miles off of the Carolinas, and was eventually recovered, and the treasure, some of it hauled up by a brilliant guy named Tommy Thompson, who then turned fugitive and finally was caught and put in jail because nobody ever got paid. But he was still a pretty smart guy. The other one being the Atocha, which people know because that was Mel Fisher's big find, and he found that in the Gulf. And his tragic death of his son and his pregnant daughter-in-law and another diver, before they found the ship, the ship that those three were on overturned in the middle of the night because a bilge pump failed and they all drowned. And 10 years later to the day, Fisher found the Atocha, and there was then an 8-year court battle as to who got what. The state and the feds wanted all of it, and then they wanted half of it, and the Supreme Court finally said finders keepers, so they got none of it. So that sort of brings us up to date. I plugged my book, which, hey, some of you bought, so thanks a lot. And we had a couple quizzes, and we might have one or two more. So that brings us up to the 1715 Plate disaster. Now, most of the photos that I'm going to show you are courtesy of my Aunt Jane, and that's because her husband, Uncle Dan, found this treasure. And it's kind of funny because Tommy Thompson was the guy that raised the treasure from the Central America. My wife's uncle is Dan Thompson, and he married Jane Thomas. So it's a little confusing between all of these. But this was the Plate fleet, and it's called that because it had a lot of China on this, on board of these ships. They were 13 ships, and they carried over 14 million pesos. And if you were here yesterday, you remember that a peso was the equivalent of a silver dollar or a British pound at the time. And so over 1,000 lives were lost in this hurricane that struck on July 30th, 1715. Now, what happened was this fleet was very late in getting off, as this happened quite a lot with the Spanish. And they were always desperate to get more gold in to finance their wars and their entire economy, because without the treasure ships, they couldn't pay their soldiers, they couldn't wage war, they couldn't run their government. So half of the fleet had gone to Veracruz in Mexico to deliver mercury, to refine silver for the mint there. And as we said yesterday, of course, the mercury was highly poisonous, and the expression "mad as a hatter" referred to the London hat makers who would rub the hats with mercury to get them clean, and then they went nuts. So The, the ships that had gone to Veracruz linked up with the ships which were bearing both Peruvian and Colombian treasure in Havana. And it was a little disorganized, so the fleet actually left 2 years late. So Spain is now desperate to have this fleet come back and finance their government. So, as I said, 13 ships were lost in the hurricane. Now, this was very, very close to shore. As we said yesterday, a hurricane's eye looks for treasure ships, sends them to the bottom. And so many of them have perished that way. A lot of the survivors swam or waded ashore, and there was a mission in St. Augustine which had been set up just for this kind of thing, and they wound up, the ones that survived, up the coast in St. Augustine. And the rest, of course, perished in the storm. The hurricane was right off Sebastian, Florida, and the ships were driven inshore and smashed on the rocks. And as we pointed out, most ships that sink, these galleons sink very close to shore because that's where the rocks are, and that's where the bottom will rip the bottom out of the ship, rocks and the coral, and they try to make it inshore anyway. So most of the ships that are sunk with treasure are actually very close to shore. So the Crown was really upset because they lost this fleet, and they tried to recover the treasure. And they actually did recover over half of the treasure of this fleet. But between the Spanish pirates and poachers, and they used Indian slaves that held their breath and went down and recovered what they could get. And over time, over half of this fleet's treasure was recovered. Now that's a picture of a typical Spanish flagship. This was 155 feet long, 150 feet tall, and it would have 50 to 60 guns to protect what it was carrying. And it carried really little cargo except treasure. And in this particular case, they carried plates and china. And sometimes the china was from actually China, that had been brought over. But the bulk of it was gold, silver, and emeralds. And these ships were heavy, they were slow, they were unwieldy, and they were the perfect target for really bad weather. Now, I'm going to show you how close these ships really are. That is the 1715 plate wreck, and you can see the shore right down there. You can swim to it. The actual name of that ship has never been identified, but it was the ship that was found by a guy named Kip Wagner and my wife's Uncle Dan. And I'll tell you the story. It's pretty interesting. Dan Thompson was a colonel in the Air Force, and they were in the midst of trying to get a man to the moon after Kennedy said we're going to put a man to the moon by the end of the 60s decade. And that's what he and his fellow officers were in the middle of. So they worked at the Cape, and they lived right there. So there was a hurricane in 1965, and his son, which would be, I guess, my nephew-in-law, was walking on the beach and snagged his ankle on what he thought was a piece of seaweed, but it was a gold chain. And that led to the discovery of the 1715 wreck that offshore. So these guys were, of course, all responsible for getting a man to the moon, but on weekends they formed a company called Real 8, and you might remember a real is a Spanish coin, the lowest coin they had, and there were 8 of them, so they called themselves Real 8, and they were all set out together to find where the ship really was. The wreck was in 15 to 30 feet of water, depending on what part of it they were working, and it was only 300 yards offshore. The problems with shallow wrecks are murky water, especially in that area. A lot of sediment, scattering. Sometimes a wreck would be already salvaged, or there could be a wreck on top of a wreck. And when you look for a wreck, there's nothing really, there's nothing to look for that looks like a ship, because all the wood has been eaten up by worms and other marine life. And so they used a magnetometer for one thing, and some pretty crude tools. So Kip Wagner and Dan, this is this tub they bought, World War II surplus, and they had a metal detector and a rented airplane. That's all they had. And they went out to find this wreck, which they did. In the meantime, they heard about a guy that ran this company called Treasure Salvers out in California named Mel Fisher. Fisher, who I know you all have heard of, had never found anything in the water, but he was pretty good at generating publicity, so they said to him, why don't you come east with us, we'll form up, and we'll all look for this together. So that's what they did. So Fisher joined up with the Real 8 boys, and they began trying to work the wreck. So they made a 50-50 deal. Now, and again, all these pictures are courtesy of my wife's aunt. This is the company crew from Real 8. Some were engineers at Cape Kennedy, others just Air Force officers. And Colonel Dan was head of the missile test range at Patrick as well. And one of the things that they invented, which I think got attributed to Fisher, but really these guys invented it, was the mailbox. And the mailbox really was, you take the prop exhaust and you put it in a tube, kind of like a vacuum cleaner tube, and you put it down to where you want to move the sand away and rev the engine, and then of course it scatters the sand and you can see what's underneath. And they use that quite extensively to search for the treasure. Here they are getting ready to dive in this very, very murky water. A lot of sharks in that area, and it's still true because in Florida, that's where most of the shark attacks occur, right up in that area, even to this day. The other problem they had was moray eels, which are normally not a problem to a diver, but these guys were sticking their hands in holes and trying to find it, so they would run into morays. Everything was buried in the sand. So they blew the sand away with the mailbox. And they had nothing to give them any guidance because, as I said, the wood from the ships was all already eaten away by what are called teredo worms and other saltwater creatures. And they did this for several years. This is a picture of a clear dive day, and not very clear, is it? So they had a little bit difficult conditions. Now, Colonel Dan had something that you could no longer have, and he had a beach cottage right on the beach. You can't do this anymore. And they use it as kind of their staging area. So this is a picture of a typical dive day. What they brought up, they would stack it on the porch and sort it out later. So this is the end of one day. You can see a lot of coins and other artifacts there. They ran into the state of Florida right away. And the state of Florida said, no, we're going to monitor this because we want a lot of this treasure. This was before Mel Fisher won his landmark case, so Dan and the Real 8 wound up giving 35% of the treasure away to the state. And they would have officers there, as you see the one cop, and he would help log the stuff in. They didn't trust Mel Fisher, and they actually found one of these guys hiding in the bushes to see what they were bringing up. So the state would oversee the day's loot, and I'm sorry I said 35%. They got 25%. So when it was all said and done, the total haul from this was estimated at $3 million, and they never did find the main body of the wreck. So there's at least $14 million still to be found, and I don't know if divers are working it right now, but it's still out there. this was one of the main uh, guys in the group, Kip Wagner, and if you can see, he's got silver wedges, and this was a pretty clever idea. They would put these wedges which formed a circle at the bottom of kegs, which they would in casks, and they would cover them either with rags or water or whatever, so that if they got raided, whoever raided them, whatever the pirates wouldn't be able to find these pieces of silver. Of course, it only worked once, you know. Then then they all knew what to do. Now, this particular guy is a guy named Harry Cannon, and when he brought up the first piece of this pie, he took it home to his wife because he lived pretty close, and it was the middle of the day, and he said, look what we found today. And she said, why are you home? Get back out there and find the rest of it. So they went out and dove again and came up with that. Later on in 1965, the National Geographic ran a special issue, and this is the picture that I took out of that issue. Dan brought up these, it says gold, but they're silver coins. And this silver degrades underwater, and there are actually, in that batch of coins, over 1,500 silver coins that had been almost wafer thin now. They were pretty much eroded away. And here's a picture of it on the dock. And so they weren't useful, of course, as artifacts. They were just for their silver content. And the silver converts to silver chloride, and it gets black sometimes. So it gets eaten away to wafers. On the other hand, gold is untouchable, and that was the picture when they took the mailbox and blew away a piece of sand, and that's what was laying there, all those coins. So that was a pretty good day. Now, what happened was, a couple years ago, there was a special on National Geographic documenting this whole thing, and it said that one night Aunt Jane came home and turned on the bedroom light, and the whole bed was covered with these coins. So I'm watching this, I'm saying, wow. So I called her up. I said, that's just hype, right? And the show was still on. She said, no, that happened. I said, wow, all that gold. So, in fact, all the women in our family wear one of these on a chain around their neck. So if there's ever a get-together and they're all there, they all have them. It's quite a sight. Here are some of the items that were brought up by Dan and his group. This is an amethyst ring with beautifully carved flowers all around it. Most of these items wound up at auction. That's a 2.5-carat rough-cut diamond with 6 smaller stones around it. It doesn't look that impressive because it's a rough cut, but it was quite valuable. These were silver forks with mint marks to show the silver content from each one, and as you can see, they're pretty eaten away, a lot of them. And as opposed to this, which was gold and looked just like that when they brought it up. So that was a medallion with religious pictures on each side. And they brought up many chains because the chains were used for currency at the time back in Spain, and they would weigh the chain, and that's what it was worth. And all this gold was either 22 or 24 carat. Here are silver pieces of 8, and they have an assayer's mint mark on them to verify that there's an ounce of silver in there. And a piece of 8 didn't have to be round, as you can see, as long as they held an ounce of silver, and that was the coin of the day. Here's a silver dinner service they brought up. They brought up that whole service in one day. And there it is sitting on Dan's porch. That's hard to tell what it is, but it's actually a cross that is encrusted with shells. And this was a big seller at Sotheby's auction house. And this was a Maltese cross with 12 diamonds, probably worn by a priest. A lot of the things that were brought up were gold ornamental pieces were for the clergy. The Spanish priests had it pretty good as far as their jewelry, what they wore and what they had. This is a very delicate porcelain bowl discovered by a diver named John Jones. And of course, they had to bring all this stuff up without breaking it, but it just wasn't that deep. I mean, it was turbulent, but it wasn't that deep. Okay, here's a little quiz question. Now that you've seen what these cups look like, which cup is from the Kangxi dynasty? Okay, you ready? This is number 1 or number 2? Number 1 or number 2? Okay, this is free. You know, I told. Here are 28 porcelain cups and bowls recovered all in one day, all as perfect as the day they were packed. It's amazing that these ships would go down and smash up and sink, and a lot of that cargo sometimes would be totally undisturbed. You know, Colonel Dan told me an astronaut joke. He said that they had discovered a restaurant on the moon. And he said, great food, but no atmosphere. He was pretty funny guy, Okay, here's some pewter dishes, all part of the same haul. And sometimes they would find half the set, and the next day they'd find the other half. That's a gold crucifix. And these are what are called Mexican Malajica bowls. I don't know what a Malajica bowl is, except that's one. Those are several of them. And they were part of the treasure as well. Now, this was a 7-pound, it's called a biscuit, when it's a big clump of gold. And this was a 7-pound gold biscuit stamped with the X1, which was believed to be an inventory number. Now, this 7 pounds, I mean, boy, that's a lot of money in that biscuit. You bring that up in a day, that's pretty good. And a gold medallion of religious significance there. And they brought up a lot of chains. Here's a bunch of them with crosses on them draped over a small ornamental cannon that they had. An earring with a pearl missing. They found the mate on the next day's dive. Can you imagine being a diver on this stuff and bringing this stuff up every day and all these dollar signs, you know, in shallow water? So gold buckles, crosses, medallions, and this is sitting on a huge silver bar that weighed 36 pounds that they brought up. And again, here are, this isn't the same picture, but these are more gold coins, doubloons that they retrieved. And it's amazing how perfect they are because they're gold and nothing happens to gold. It was just a carpet they found when they put the mailbox down and blew the sand away. This is called a escudo. This was a big deal coin, and this is one in perfect condition. It says on one side, Philip V, by the grace of God, 1714. It minted in Mexico City, and it's marked by the assayer, Jose de Leon, and its value of 8 escudos with Spanish coat of arms on it. Here's the reverse side of that, with a Jerusalem cross on it. And they found 23 of those. This was an interesting piece, and this was actually found on the ground after the hurricane. It's a dragon pendant, and it was functional because there's a toothpick in the belly of the dragon, an ear cleaning spoon at the tail. The mouth contained a whistle, and so it was functional. found by a 17-year-old kid that was the son of one of the treasure salvers. These are. This is the chain from that dragon piece, and it's got had 4 strands containing 2,176 handmade links, each faceted with rosettes. Wow. Wow. And here we have another day's haul on Dan's cabin steps at turning night. And this happened every single day that they dove. So actually every day, I mean every weekend. I don't know why these guys stayed with their jobs, but they did. They did. This is Dan and his wife Aunt Jane, who was eyeing the dragon at the Sotheby's auction, which went for $50,000. Now Dan really had it pretty good. Besides being an Air Force colonel and finding the treasure, he was married to Jane, who was a top New York model. She's still alive, and she's, I think, 90-some years old. And for a 90-year-old, she's still kind of a looker. So Dan kind of really had it all. But he died a couple of years ago. This picture was also in National Geographic, and this is a picture of him with a piece of gold that he had brought up. These guys from Reel 8 remained good friends and met many times over the ensuing years to relive their sort of awe-inspiring tale and their daring do, their adventures. And of course, Mel Fisher went on for his 16-year search for the Atocha, which he eventually did find a piece of it. Most of that Atocha is still missing, by the way. They never found the Stern Castle, which is where the most of the treasure was always stored. So, in the end, they only recovered a fraction of this unnamed ship. Dan and the Reel 8 boys. And I don't know if it's being worked today, but you can swim out to the area and give it a shot, So they never found the Stern Castle. They estimate that 6 of the 13 ships that the 1715 fleet that went down are still undiscovered. So people are still working it, trying to find it, and it goes on to this day. Now, here's something that I did that I thought was pretty clever. My wife's got a lot of pieces from this haul. Well, a few pieces anyway. And for insurance purposes, I got the idea to put a Scrabble tile next to whatever it was, take the picture, and then you see, give you a size of it, and then you made up a sheet. Okay, what's A, what's B? And I thought that was a pretty good way to keep track of insurance, and then put the paper in a safety deposit box or whatever. So there's a piece of 8 that goes around your neck. Here's a little pinky ring, which is made out of a very small coin. And this article really aggravated me because a group of people got the rights to search an area where they thought a ship had gone down. I don't know if it's part of this fleet or not. And when I read it, I realized this is right off my dad's oceanfront property. And I had been out one day and found what I thought was a sewer pipe. And when I read this article, I thought maybe there was a cannon. But I could never find it again. So, okay. Now, I thought we could liven this up a little bit. As I may have told you, I make movies when I'm not doing this. And since I hardly ever get the money to make another movie, I do this more than I probably want to. But that's what it is. So I've got a little bit of a movie quiz. Is that okay? Okay. All right. Now, you all remember John Cazale, this guy? Okay, he holds an amazing Hollywood record. He only acted in 5 films before he died. And you probably know some of them. Okay, there was, right? Godfather, Godfather 2, The Conversation. I don't know if everybody saw that, Dog Day Afternoon, and finally, Deer Hunter. What was so amazing about all those films, which were the only ones he ever appeared in, was, anybody? This. All 5 were nominated for Best Picture Academy Award. That's a pretty good record for an actor, right? Okay. Now, here's some, there's always stories about famous ad libs that weren't in the script. And I'm not so sure that they're all true, or some of them were hype from the studios. But these are all supposed to be true ad libs. So I'll show you the picture, see if you remember the line that came out that actually was not scripted. The line is, "Here's Johnny," right? Okay, here's another one. Here's the line. That wasn't in the script. Now in this one, I know you know what the line is. You talking to me? Hey, I'm the only one here. Well, actually, I've seen the script, and the script only says that Travis talks to the mirror. So he made that whole thing up, and of course it got to be very, very famous. The next one, there aren't too many more, okay?